Hello Con, your friendly CSA Health and Wellbeing Officer here with some thoughts about musicians and their futures and what that means for us being in the environment, in like the conservatory environment and also in the current environment as it is today. Feeling fabulous as always. So the thing that got me thinking about what I was going to talk about was this particular situation. So I, like many classical singers, make a bit of money singing for churches for their services and such. Now, obviously, that sort of ended when we went into lockdown. No church services were happening. However, when they sort of relaxed restrictions, they asked if I could come back so they could record a couple of different pieces so they could put them on their online masses. So that'd be a nice thing for them to do. While I was there, I was chatting to the organist there. Now, she's a woman who's been there for quite a few years. She's very lovely. And while we were chatting, she asked me if I knew anyone that could do singing lessons. And I was like, oh, I'm not really sure what you mean. Like, what are you looking for in particular? And she says, oh, I do my music and I sing for that. And I would like to just improve, my tone and a couple of different things like that. And I go, oh, that makes sense. You're an organist. You write your own music. You write your own hymns. And she just says, no. I write like jazz and like electronica and that sort of thing. And I go, oh, interesting. And she says, look, what you can do, give my name out to a couple of people, and if they're wondering what I'm looking for, what the style I sing is, get them to listen to my Spotify. And I'm like, oh, okay, and cool, you release the music on Spotify. I look up her Spotify. She has 50,000 monthly listens and apparently is regularly featured on Triple J. This soft-spoken, very lovely woman who plays the organ at this church that I work at is a grime artist. And I had this moment of sort of thinking to myself, this woman, her primary form of income, her living, is working at this church and a couple of other churches and also music teaching. That's what she does. But she also makes music. It's probably not her living, but it is a very important part of what she does as a musician. So here I am thinking to myself, this is such a different way of conceptualizing musicianship. It's two very different roles. And I just would like to share some thoughts about that based on stuff I've sort of looked up around it. Thinking about our futures is not something we typically like to do, particularly for people our age. I don't know about the majority of you, but personally, I am in a perpetual state of existential anxiety about not only how the world is going to look, but specifically how music is going to look. Where is the place of employment for people like us who go through a conservatory? Tertiary education is a time of change for a lot of people. Usually it's a time of shifting perspectives. You have new social networks that you're working through. Particularly for musicians, it's a time when we grapple with sort of realities about our futures and what we're interested in. Not that this is a bad thing. It's sort of just a time of very rapidly evolving change, and it can be very overwhelming. Particularly in conservatories, because we are, a certain amount of people locked up basically in a building with each other, and everyone is at such a high level and everyone's sort of working towards the same goals. It can be very overwhelming to sort of be in this environment. Now, conservatoriums are there for a specific reason. The reason, or at least it used to be, was that they were there to develop your technical skill as a musician. You were there to learn your craft in order to work towards becoming a performer. Now, this is not reflective of the way that most people are employed, or whereas the way that most people work in the music industry as it currently is. Dawn Bennett is a researcher from Curtin University in Perth, and her primary area of study is seeing how people approach employability. So she does research into a multitude of new areas. She's even done some research with Jennifer Rowley from the Con. And her research is quite fascinating, particularly for us as musicians, because the way that musicians work as musicians is wildly different to the way that almost every other profession works. she did a study in 2007, so it's fairly old, but it found that out of classical musicians, only 6% were employed as only performers. That was the only thing that they did. So out of the rest of the people, 90% of classical musicians had some sort of secondary occupation. They worked in a multitude of different sectors. Some of them had jobs in corporate offices, in banks. Other people worked in other areas of the arts sector, places such as teaching. 77% of them would teach. And it's sort of this diversity of things, that the fact that so few people work only as performers is what I found sort of interesting. When we're in this conservatory environment, we are sort of conditioned, not necessarily by, you know, the structure of the environment. It's sort of just a general contextual thing that people aim for a career as a performer, and that's an admirable thing. However, it's not the reality for the vast majority of us. 94% of us will not be employed only as performers. I think it sort of has a relationship to our perspectives on musicianship. So much of the perspectives on musicianship are influenced by the idea that musicians are performers and only performers. However, if we take a look at the people who teach us, for some of them, they might be people who work as performers. Maybe not full-time, but for a lot of the time they do. They'll have their own projects to work on. Some of them will run businesses through the music. Some of them will be recording artists. Some of them will be session artists. Some of them will make their own music, like the church organist. There are so many different ways to approach musicianship that are sort of trampled under the rug a bit by the context that we live in. So, we have this concept to describe this. It's called portfolio careers. The basic idea of it is that people have multiple different roles that they fulfill as a career, not just one job, which is the generally accepted model in a lot of other professions, but not in music. It's unique in that aspect. The basic idea of a portfolio career is that people have multiple roles. Probably the easiest example that we can see of this is our music teachers, the people who teach us at the con. A lot of them are performers, but they will also have other fields that they lie in. They'll be composers, they will be session musicians, they will be pit players, they will be orchestral musicians, they will run their own arts organizations, they will perform outreach, education, so many different things. Very rarely are they employed only in one field, and that is all that they do. Now, here's the thing about portfolio careers. It can be very daunting for us to sort of think to ourselves that we will not be doing a certain thing, that we will be doing multiple different things. It can feel like we've sort of been stretched in many different directions. The idea of this, it's difficult to come to grips with. However, it's something that we do need to come to grips with, and there are a couple of ways that we can do this. One of the best things to do is to cultivate your own interests and use that as a guide to inform what you do. So, for instance, you may be doing a lot of historically informed performance, and there are sort of avenues for that. You may be doing academia, and you find that that works well for you, and that's something you're interested in. Finding those things, particularly at this time when you're in a tertiary institution, when you have these opportunities here for you, and working through those to sort of narrow down your focus and then use that as a jumping off point to work out what areas you'd be interested in working in. There are a couple of different skills that are useful for portfolio careers. The three main ones that we can think of are pedagogy skills, business skills, and networking. Like we've already said, 77% of classical musicians work as teachers in some form, and this includes people who can make a living as a performer full-time. One example I can find, I had the privilege of meeting Taryn Fiebig, and she is an excellent performer, and I don't doubt that if she would like to, she would be able to make a living off just performing. However, she communicated to me and a couple others in this group that were in sort of meeting her that one of the things that she loves most is teaching. So she has chosen to occupy about half of her time, to split her time evenly between performing and teaching, because those are the two things that she's passionate about. One of the other important things that we can sort of think about is business skills, which is not something we necessarily think about as musicians. You know, the art comes first is sort of the idea. That may be true, but business skills are nonetheless a very important thing. If you have a particular passion, without business skills to sort of turn it into a living for yourself, the passion remains a passion. You'll probably have to do something to supplement it. Not necessarily, but that may be the reality of what happens. The other skill that we can learn is networking. Networking gets a bad rap. We think of it a lot of the time as schmoozing. It feels sort of dirty to do. However, I think it's important to realize that a lot of the networking that you do is not only with people outside your circles, but inside the circle of the con. These people that you're studying with, you will be working with for the rest of your life. So these are your friends. There is an element of reciprocity to this. People will offer you opportunities, and you will also have opportunities to offer them. Not only that, they will be people that you have positive relationships with, and it's important to maintain those. And I think this is a neat little way to remind you to reach out to a friend and keep connected. I think exciting things happening with the way that restrictions are sort of being gradually eased, and we're all coming back to semester and we'll be learning together again. But, you know, it's still worth the time to sort of reach out to someone. A lot of this specifically has to do with classical musicians, but the same rings true for musicians of any kind. Jazz, contemporary composers, music educators, a diverse skill set, and sort of having your eggs in many different baskets allows you to be much more flexible as a musician and to more realistically be employable. I hope some of this helps. Just in general about thinking about your future as a musician. I know it helped me quite a lot. I will link Dawn Bennett's research in the description. She has so much stuff on developing your sort of employable skills. It's really quite useful, I found. But that's me signing off. That's my 2 cents. Let me know what you think. Stay safe. See you all soon.